Hello, it's time for another Gita video. And we're looking at chapter 2, verses 55 to 59 today. You might remember in the last Gita video we looked at verse 54, where Arjuna asks that most difficult of questions. He says, how do you recognize someone who is in the state of absolute transcendental enlightenment? He says, how does someone like this speak? How does he sit? How does he walk? Right? And this is the trickiest question in esoteric spirituality, because it's a question that can't be effectively answered. Almost any explanation given by someone who has experienced enlightenment is going to be misinterpreted by the listener. In fact, pretty much every mainstream world religion today and ever came out of that sort of a misunderstanding. So it's a very hard question. The reason is it ties into this idea of what in Western esoteric tradition was called the ape of Thoth. Thoth was the god of knowledge in the Egyptian pantheons, like Mercury or Hermes, right? And he had a monkey that went with him. And this monkey would go around chattering very loudly, so that whatever Thoth said, everything Thoth said was true and wise, but it was never heard because instead the monkey was the one making the noise. And you see kind of a parallel to this in Eastern thought with what's called the monkey mind, right? That the mind is this chattering thing that makes a noise that makes it impossible to hear truth or to see truth. And that's kind of the problem here, is that it's because the state of enlightenment is a state that's beyond dualism. It means that it is transcendental. And so that means that any attempt to express it in words is going to fall flat. It's not going to be an accurate description of the experience. So the best that you can do is try to make an approximation of it. But any approximation is bound to be interpreted by the listener from the point of view of their self-referencing, right? Of their own existing perspective and the desire to interpret everything through their psyche and their ego. So with that self-referencing, you end up inevitably having an incorrect conclusion about what is being said about enlightenment. You latch on to the wrong thing. You catch the wrong definition or the wrong turn of the definition, and you don't get it right. So Arjuna is asking Krishna a very complicated question. And in these verses we're going to look at now, Krishna tries to answer him. And usually this has been interpreted as, these 5 verses as one solid deal, right? Like that he's describing every detail of what it is to be enlightened. But if you really look at these verses, he's describing different things. He's giving different definitions each time. He's trying to express it in 5 different ways here in these verses, so that in the hopes that the overall gist of it would make sense, right? But as we're going to see, Arjuna doesn't quite catch it either in any specific version or in the overall gist. So, the Blessed One said, "One such as this is free of any kind of investments, son of Partha, and free of mental notions, purely centered in his soul, fulfilled. One who obtains this is said to have achieved awareness. One who is surrounded by miseries without himself being distressed. One who is surrounded by happiness without himself being invested, free from desire, fear, or anger. He whose awareness is steady, he is called a mystic. One who avoids sentimentality, regardless of the situation, takes good or bad results without pride or envy, he is in a state of awareness. When he can draw inside himself, like the turtle draws its limbs into its shell, separating the senses from the sensed, he is in a state of awareness. Some abstain from the material sources of pleasure for the sake of appearing religious, but will secretly keep lusting for these things. But one who actually gives up the lust for these things, he will experience a vastly greater pleasure. So these are all attempts to give a definition, to answer Arjuna's question. Not really to answer the way Arjuna put it, because Arjuna put it in an especially stupid way. He said, how do you know what kind of man is? How can you tell? What does he say? How does he walk? Right? How does he sit? Right? And I mean, and that's like the most superficial thing. And most people are looking for an answer on that level. They want to know the right strut that that an enlightened person has, or the right way of talking. If he talks too fast, he must not be enlightened. Or if he talks too slow, he must not be enlightened. Or if he talks too loud, if he shouts, he couldn't possibly be enlightened, right? So an enlightened person will speak in this specific tone and at this speed while he's sitting in a very particular way, right? An enlightened person wouldn't slouch. Or maybe an enlightened person would only slouch, who knows, right? So this is the most imbecilic, most vapid kind of way of looking at the question, right? And so Krishna is immediately trying to get him to look at it in a different way. He's saying it's not about how he sits or walks or talks. It's about his state, his inner state, right? So in the first definition, he says, someone who is free of any kind of investments and free of mental notions, right? If you're not trying to make the world fit your mental notions, right? What you would like the world to be. If you're centered in yourself, centered in the soul, if you're fulfilled, if you're total within yourself, then you're an enlightened person. You're aware, right? And you could just feel, Krishna looking at Arjuna while he's saying this and seeing that Arjuna's latching on maybe to the wrong things, right? He's not getting it. So he tries it again. He says, one that is surrounded by miseries without himself being distressed. One who is surrounded by happiness without himself being invested, free from desire, fear, or anger. He whose awareness is steady, he is called a mystic. Now, this is not as good a definition as the first one, let me tell you. The first one is a much more purified version of the definition of enlightenment. Someone free of investment, free of mental notions, centered in themselves, and total. Okay, that is enlightenment. But it's very vague in a way for somebody to understand what is being meant by that, right? And even there, it's way open to misinterpretation, right? What does it mean to be free of investments? What does it mean to be free of mental notions? Because people have to act in the world nonetheless, right? Anybody who's alive is acting in the world. So is an enlightened person free of investments if they're, would that mean that they wouldn't have any goals, no purpose, they wouldn't do anything? Or would it mean that they would do things, but not for a reason of an end goal or something like that, right? But it's very easy to trip up on that one, right? So the next one, he says, okay, if you're surrounded by sadness, but you're not sad, if you're surrounded by happiness, but you're not happy, you're not tied to that happiness, right? If you're free from desire, from fear, and from anger, all of that is true. That is a definition of enlightenment, right? If you overcome fear, if you overcome anger, if you overcome desire, then if your awareness is steady, you're a mystic, right? You're enlightened. But again, it is very much open to misinterpretation, more so than the last one. Because does this mean that an enlightened person never acts in a way that appears to be afraid or angry or desirous, right? Because Krishna did, and Lao Tzu did. We know that. We know that the Buddha was frequently grumpy. Krishnamurti in the 20th century was known to be very grumpy. Gurdjieff loved his drink, and so did Chogyam Trungpa. So did a whole bunch of people, right? And so if you look at it in the wrong sense of that overcome, of having overcome desire, having overcome fear, if you don't understand that transcendental means that you are beyond being bound by it, not that you don't experience it, then there's a great possibility of being misinterpreted here, right? So people will look at this and they'll say, oh, well, if I find someone who acts like they don't really care about anything and they're never bothered by anything, then that guy must be enlightened, right? So he tries again. One who avoids sentimentality, regardless of the situation, takes good or bad results without pride or envy, he is in a state of awareness. This is, again, another good definition, or as good as we can do, of enlightenment. Maybe not quite as good as the last two, right? But he keeps trying to bring it more down to earth, so to say, right? And to try to avoid the pitfalls of what could be misinterpreted. If you are avoiding sentimentality, what is sentimentality? That means that you're not doing things out of your feelings, your immediate feelings, right? But somebody could interpret that as meaning that you shouldn't feel anything at all, right? If you can take good or bad results without pride or envy, all right, that's a very straightforward type of definition, right? Where you can accept good things without being proud, if you can accept bad things without being envious of other people. But it can be very difficult sometimes to understand the difference between something like outrage or something like envy, between something like a teaching of a lesson and something like pride, right? And you have to then ask, well, what is pride? What is envy, right? So envy, does that mean that you're that you only don't want what other people have, or that you're not worried about being recognized at all, or are you only really avoiding enviousness if you are avoiding any desire to achieve or be known to have achieved anything? So it still draws in a whole bunch of complications there. So we go to another definition. When he can draw inside himself, and you'll note here, Krishna has kind of given up on the outside world altogether. He said, okay, screw it. None of this stuff is going to be able to explain it correctly, because no matter what I say, you won't get what I'm getting at. So let's forget the outside world. Let's talk about the inner world of the enlightened. Okay, so if he can draw inside himself, like a turtle draws its limbs into its shell, separating the senses from the sense, he is in a state of awareness. It's a very correct definition of enlightenment, right? Someone who is capable of creating a separation between the senses and the sense, between recognizing that what is around them is not them, and that release from narcissism, right? That you are not the center of the universe, and that you're able to be perfectly contained within yourself, right? Within your own being, without feeling a need to make everything else a part of your own being, right? And of course, there's another step there of the fuller enlightenment being when you can let go of your own being and just be a part of the landscape, right? But I think Krishna wasn't going to go into that here. So he says, okay, let's look at the kind of the arhat, right? Is the guy who is total within himself, separate from the outer, separating the senses from the sense, right? But then immediately Krishna realizes that he's made a mistake again, or that he's failed to be able to express it without misinterpretation again. Because and I know exactly what happened there, because the next line gives it away, right? Arjuna looked at that and said, oh, okay, so the guy who retires from the world, just like I want to do, I want to retire, I want to run away from this battle. I don't want to fight. I want to go and run away in the forest and hide. I want to be an ascetic. The ascetic guy is enlightened because he's separated himself. He can be just completely happy on his own, totally alone, not connected to anything else, and separating himself from all sensual pleasures. That's what you're saying. That's what I want. I want to run away from this fight. So obviously that would make me enlightened if I went and did it, right? So Krishna jumps in with the last verse. He says, some people abstain from the material sources of pleasure for the sake of appearing religious, but will secretly keep lusting for these things. Who actually gives up the lust for these things, he will experience a greater pleasure. Okay? So he tries one last time there to kind of express it, to say, look, no, it's not about the things. It's not, you're not going into yourself to get away from something. You're going into yourself to get to something. The withdrawing into yourself, meditation, going inside. You know, my guru used to say, don't freak out, freak in, right? But the freaking in isn't to escape what's out there. It's not to escape the world. It's not to escape material things. It's not because material things are good or bad. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with going in to discover a world, to enter into this vastness that is the inner universe, right? So you have to not worry about the material things and trying to saying, oh, I've avoided all material things doesn't do anything for you, okay? So Krishna realizes that Arjuna has failed to understand every single time here, right? And in the end, he mistakenly ends up leading Arjuna to the point where Arjuna was about to argue that then an awakened person is a renunciate, right? Is somebody who gives up just material things exactly like Arjuna wanted to do, right? But an awakened person isn't that. An awakened person is someone who is completely in the world, who is total, but who can also step completely out of the world and be total still, right? He is in himself a cosm, right? Like a microcosm and a macrocosm, right? He is a cosm unto himself. He is a star in his own orbit. There's nothing to stop him from going out and being completely a part of all of creation without needing himself to be in the middle of it, without needing to hold on to anything of himself. And he's also able to go completely within and be completely within himself without having to cling to anything from the outside world, and not because he's running from anything on the outside world. But even that definition is bound to be misinterpreted. So I think we've heard enough from the ape of Thoth, and I'll get you on the next video.